Welcome to Hashtag Trending, the Weekend Edition. I'm your host, Jim Love. When I was a kid, I was a bit of a loner. Big shock, right? Yeah. Nothing made me happier than sitting there reading a book or something that grabbed me. My favorite reading? Mysteries. My favorite character? Sherlock Holmes. The way he could solve a puzzle. I loved puzzles. I loved mysteries. I loved word puzzles. Oh, I'm one of those kids who thought the secret decoder ring from Roger Ramjet was just the greatest thing in the world. And I even tried learning Morse code so I could try to decipher the sounds I heard on this old multiband radio that I had found and repaired, remarkably without killing myself. Although to this day, I still know what a ground wire is. Now, later I would sell papers on Saturdays down by the Kresges in Port Arthur for the News Chronicle, and I would keep one of the papers so I could read Ann Landers, our version of Dear Abby in Canada, the advice columnist, the double sets of funnies, one inside the paper and the other color comics. And then there was this thing called the cryptogram. It was an encrypted message you had to solve. Now forget the crossword. The cryptogram was the work of real detectives. So I had to learn the frequency of letters. And there's no internet at this point. I'm going to the library for books. I learned what the likely positions of letters were, where they weren't. And slowly I learned to crack these messages. Now, they were nothing special when you cracked them. But as a kid, the satisfaction of breaking a code, that was it. Now, later as I got older, the radio spent more time on a Chicago radio station that played rock and roll songs before they made their way to our backwoods, and the code breaking went away. Decades later, I actually enrolled in a course in linguistics, and it all came back. In my adult life, I still read mysteries. I love them, but the ones with codes and things to crack still keep me engrossed. The Name of the Rose, the Da Vinci Code. So when I got a note from the authors of this book called Code Breaking, a practical guide, I had to have them on the show. So welcome to my guests, Ilonka Dunan and Klaus Schmey, authors of Code Breaking, a practical guide. Welcome to both of you.
Happy to be here.
So Ilonka, you're a game developer by trade and also the author of a number of books, including The Secrets of Lost Symbols, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code sequel. Tell me more about this.
So this was The Secrets of the Lost Symbol was an anthology put together with articles from experts in various fields talking about the fact and fiction of Dan's latest novel, which was at that time was The Lost Symbol, the sequel to the Da Vinci Code. And I had 2 articles in that anthology about a sculpture called Kryptos, which is an encrypted sculpture at the center of CIA headquarters with 4 codes on it, 4 codes on the sculpture.
Yeah, we have to talk about this. I caught this in the back of the book last night. I'm making notes. We're going to have a discussion about this. I'm fascinated by that.
Sure.
Klaus.
Sure.
Yeah. You've authored 25 books in German, 30 research papers, and 1,600 blog posts. I just have to say, Keener, or no, that's a North American expression. But when do you sleep, man?
I usually sleep at night, but cryptology is my hobby. It's also my job. I work for a company specializing in computer-based encryption for the internet, for emails and things like that. But it's also my hobby. But in my spare time, I take care of the history of encryption, about old cryptograms, about encryption from past centuries and things like that. And that's what really fascinates me.
Wow. So I shared my story with you. How did you two get interested in code breaking? When did you first discover you had this passion? Ilonka?
Well, mine was very similar to yours, which is that when I was a kid, I would go to the dime store and there would be magazines in there, especially by Dell. And Dell did crossword puzzles, and they also did pencil puzzles and word games. And I would pick up the crossword puzzle. I would pick up the crossword puzzle magazine, and I would immediately just skip all the crossword puzzles. I had no interest in the crossword puzzles. And I would go to the stuff in the back, which was the crypto quotes and other things and logic problems. And those are the ones that I really love.
Yeah. My sisters used to buy those. They do the crosswords. I did the cryptos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Teamwork.
Yeah. Klaus, how about you? When did you get passion for
In
code
my
breaking?
case, it was completely different. Well, in my childhood and my youth, I didn't occupy myself with encryption. I didn't know what cryptology is. It was not one of my pastimes. But when I was a student, a computer science student in the 1990s, when I was about 25 or so, I took part in a cryptography class as a part of my study, and I immediately got interested. And I immediately changed all my study plans and started to specialize in cryptology. That was 30 years ago, and this means that for 30 years I've been interested in this topic.
Now, before we get into talking about the book, I'm fascinated by the fact that you guys live like 4,000 miles or 6,400 kilometers, as we say in Canada, apart. How did you meet?
We met at at one of the conferences. The NSA sponsors something which is a cryptologic history symposium once every 2 years, and both of us were attendees there. Klaus sponsored a dinner at the beginning, and I attended that dinner, and then we just got talking and haven't stopped yet.
And then you resurfaced or met again in the U.S. and started to talk about this book. How did you start the idea of the book together?
I travel to the U.S. maybe once a year or so, usually to attend a conference, and I almost always attend this MSA conference Ilonka mentioned, and so we met once in a while. And I think it was 2017 or something like that. I think it was 2017 when we met. We didn't only meet at the conference, we also spent a few days together. We had already become friends. And then I think it was on a trip to the place where the Beale treasure is allegedly hidden. And on this trip, so it was, I think, a 4-hour trip there, and we started talking about the current crypto literature. And I thought that one important kind of book is missing, and Ilonka agreed. And so on our trip back, we decided to write this book that didn't exist yet. This is how we started to work on this project.
Wow. So you started to work on a book together, and then COVID hit.
Yeah.
And I've worked on a bock with somebody, but I knew them really well. I'd known them for years, and we worked on a book during COVID. That was tough enough, but you guys had met, you were working remotely. How did this thing happening make writing the book more interesting?
We were already talking multiple times per week via, originally it was Skype, and then we switched to Zoom somewhere along the line. And for COVID, we threw in an extra twist, is that I had been attempting to go to the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. I live in Washington, D.C., but at that time I was in San Francisco. And then all of a sudden the alarm came, shelter in place.
Oh,
so I happened to be at the home of some good friends in San Francisco, John and Beth Leonard, and they very kindly offered me space to stay. So I was working out of their attic, an unair-conditioned attic, for the next 3 months or so. And Klaus and I just continued with our video calls.
Wow. You know who your friends are during something like that.
We're still friends. That's the surprising thing. We're still friends.
Even better. Yeah. So before you went to press, you had to do a major rewrite because somebody broke a code. What was that?
So our first book came out on December 10th, 2020. And we had a lot of stuff in the book there about famous unsolved codes, one of them being the Zodiac Killer ciphers from the 1960s, 1970s. So our book came out on the 10th, and December 11th, one of our colleagues, Dave Ramjet, contacted me and said, "We just cracked the Zodiac. We're going to have to rewrite the book."
Oh.
So we started on a new book, and that one just came out in September 23. So we had other things as well, but yeah, we had to do a major rewrite.
So let's talk about code breaking, and not just about making the book, which is equally interesting. And I picked up little hints from reading stuff about this, but let's talk about code breaking itself. What is it?
What is code breaking?
Go ahead.
Basically, to be honest, this is of course not the only book about code breaking on the market, but there's a major difference between our book and many others. We cover real encryption. So What you mentioned about cryptograms printed in magazines, this is not really what our book is about. Our book is about encrypted letters from the 19th century or encrypted postcards from the 20th century or encrypted newspaper advertisements from the Times or from Le Figaro or encrypted diaries. There are thousands or even tens of thousands of encrypted documents that can be found in archives or in museums. So there is plenty of real stuff. And of course, many of these real cryptograms have been solved, but others haven't. And our book is a guide on how to approach this, how you can decipher real cryptograms, real mysteries. And this makes our book different from anything else that has been written about this topic.
But in the introduction, you both say, or one of you says, I can't tell who the author of it is, that one of the things that inspired you to write this was that nobody had taken this code breaking into the world of computers that we had. There were very few books that mentioned computers or what you could do with computers. Is that true?
Yes. If we talk about traditional or old cryptograms, of course, there are books about modern cryptography, about modern encryption systems and how to analyze modern encryption system. All this exists, but the books on classical code breaking, on breaking these old paper and pencil encryptions, all these books that cover this topic are usually a few decades old, and they are agnostic of the computer. So one of our major goals was to introduce tools that can be used for breaking old ciphers with modern means. Of course, we are not the only one who do this, but we are the first ones who have written a book about it.
I will say, honestly, if anybody was thinking to read the book, there's an incredible amount of examples in there. We'll talk about some of those. But early in the book, you talk about the difference between a code and a cipher. What's the difference?
So a cipher is something that's encrypted at the level of letters. And a code is something that is encrypted usually at the level of words or concepts. So a code will usually have a code book. And so, for example, the word canary might mean 3 jets, say example. Whereas if you wanted to encrypt the word jets with a cipher, you'd encrypt the J and then the E and then the T and then the S. And that's a very simple definition of it.
But as I was reading it, I was wondering, why would one do one or the other?
It depends on what is needed for the encryption at that time. The most famous code in the world, we have the Navajo code talkers, and they would have specific words that they could use to represent various concepts. But then they also needed sort of a cipher system so they could spell out things that were not in their code language.
And I'd never thought about it in those terms. So that fascinated me. And then equally fascinating were the stories, though. And I want to ask you about those. One thing that surprised me in the book, Beatrix Potter kept a coded diary. Now, for some reason, that just leapt out at me. How common is it for people or famous people or authors to have a coded diary?
I know about, I have a kind of collection, or we made a collection for one of our publications. And I think this collection contains about 40 or so encrypted diaries. Sometimes only a part is encrypted. So on the one hand, 40 is enough to study this topic, but compared to the entire number of diaries, it's not, of course, not much. So there are many people writing diaries, but only few of them encrypting them.
Then here's another mystery for you. When I read the message that you decoded from Beatrix Potter's diary, it didn't seem like it was worth taking the time to encode. Did you keep the good stuff hidden, or are people just encoding their thoughts because they want that? Or are there secrets that you found in these diaries?
Beatrix, she came up with her encryption system while she was a teenager, a very bright teenager, and came up with her own system and then became very comfortable with it. So she could just write in her system, which for anyone who's done encryption, it's very difficult to just sit down and write in it. You need a lot of practice to do it. So with her, I don't think, mainly she was talking about different people that she knew, and maybe she didn't want them to know what she was thinking about them, or if she thought someone was overweight or boring, she could put that in the diary. Other people encrypting diaries were trying to keep it very secret from other types of prying eyes. In one case, there was a prisoner of war who wanted to write about what was happening while he was a prisoner. Of course, he did not want his captors to know about it. So he
Yep.
wrote about it, and it looked like a series of numeric tables. Another person with diaries might be writing about it where they were doing things, keeping private in their lives, perhaps about their sexuality, that they really could not talk about at that time, but that they could write about it in their diary. So with those diaries, it's fascinating because now we have a window into the past to see things that we could not see at that time that they were alive, or even in any other way. But now we can learn about it.
Yeah. Klaus, you've got 40 diaries, you say? What's the most surprising message or that you decrypted or you saw in those diaries?
As Ilonka said, this diary written by a prisoner of war is really unique and outstanding because it was not only encrypted, it was also camouflaged. So it was steganography, as we say. So if somebody looked at it, it was not clear that it was a diary because it looked like mathematical tables. And this is maybe the most singular or outstanding diary. But there are others. For example, there's an encrypted diary written by a German teacher who apparently had a lot of trouble in his life, trouble with alcohol, with his sexuality, with his relationship. And apparently he wrote everything that came to his mind into his diary and encrypted it. And this diary is a very interesting source for everyday life in the 19th century. And this is the kind of stuff that can be found in the diaries. It's nothing, usually nothing that is of importance for the course of history, but it's very important for the people who wrote about it.
Yeah, and when you talk about this theme of sexuality coming out of these things, I just can't help but think about Alan Turing, the greatest code breaker of all time, saved, I think, the West in World War II by breaking the German codes, and was gay and was hounded for that. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
It's great tragedy.
So, yeah, these people are incredibly bright as well. This is just astonishing for me. The coolest thing about code breaking that I got out of the book was it's still something that a gifted amateur can do. You point out in the book the Zodiac Killer in the 1970s. And maybe one of you can give a little bit of outline about what that is. But he defeated many professional code breakers. Why don't you get a little bit of an outline for anybody who's born after 1970 that might not know who the Zodiac Killer was?
I want to back up just a moment to what you were saying about a gifted amateur. And this is very true. And in the 19th century, people would often put encrypted ads into the newspapers, and others would pick up a newspaper and a cup of coffee and sit down and break the ciphers in the newspaper and just get little tidbits of gossip as they were decrypting these messages.
Yeah, and you've got one in the book that's a message from a wife to a husband that's encrypted, and that one just blew me away.
Most often it was between lovers, yeah.
Yeah. But let's go back to the Zodiac Killer. He was famous for writing he was a killer, mass murderer, wrote encoded messages and gave those to the police, I assume, to taunt them.
Yeah, he twisted mind, first of all. It's almost like I don't want to work sometimes on the Zodiac ciphers because I don't want to crawl into this individual's head. But he was a murderer. He terrorized Cal in the early 1970s. And he would write encrypted messages to the newspapers and demand that they publish his messages. Otherwise, he was going to go and kill more people. So sometimes he would he would break a message into parts and send a different part each to a different newspaper and then demand that they all print all of it. So his first message, which was called the Z408, because it had 408 characters in it, was actually solved very rapidly by a puzzle-loving couple in the Bay Area. And then he made a different one, a harder one, which was called the Z340 for the 340 characters. And no one could crack that. It went unsolved for generations, with many people trying and lots of fake solutions showing up. And then finally, a couple of years ago, a very interesting trio, multiple continents, the United States, Europe, and Australia, they figured out a way to crack the 340. And after 51 years. So it was quite an accomplishment.
Wow. And was that the one that caused you to actually have to do a
Yes.
rewrite of part of the book?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
But I go back to this couple sitting there. I presume that the law enforcement has all kinds of people working for them, or people who are specialists in this area, and a couple in Salinas, California cracks the code.
They did it first. There were many people working on it. There were also people such as members of the American Cryptogram Association that were working on it too. But this couple did it first.
Yeah. And the police even, I won't harp on him, but it is a fascinating story. The police even tried encoding their own message to try to catch him.
Yes. Yes, that's correct. They encoded a message with the same method the Zodiac killer used for his first cryptogram, and they published this message in the press, so encouraging him to solve this encryption. And they were hoping that he would do it and write something else to the press or so, and maybe give away information about himself. That was the plan, but it didn't work.
So let's move off the Zodiac killer, because I appreciate the darkness of that. What are other famous codes that you've seen broken?
Big in the news lately was Mary, Queen of Scots, where there were, again, some of our colleagues, George Lasry and others, they loved going spelunking through libraries and library archives, looking for anything that might be encrypted from previous centuries so that they could go and crack it. And they were going through the archives in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library. And they were pointed at some documents. They had no titles. There was nothing on there that was readable. Nobody knew who it was to or from. And there was just the vague thing of, we think they're in Italian. And so George and his group took a look, couldn't crack it, weren't getting anything Italian. And then they said, maybe it's another language, maybe it's French. And so they worked on it and they started getting bits and pieces out of it. And they figured out the method and who wrote all these encrypted messages. And they saw it seemed to have been written by a noble and someone who was talking about their son, and around this time frame. And they realized it was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was imprisoned by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I at the time. And she was writing, trying to get messages out, trying to get support from other areas of Europe. And so she was writing to the French ambassador at the time.
Wow. And I was going to ask you this, Klaus, because you write in German. You've written a number of books in German. Is it strange to try and break a code in another language?
It depends. For me, it's easier, of course, to break a code in German, but English works too. There have been even successful code breakers who didn't even speak the language that they were breaking. It's not only a matter of speaking the language, it's also about language statistics and things like that, and linguistics, how a language really works. And sometimes, or very often, a native, you do this unconsciously. You just use the language, you don't know how it really works. And this leads to people not speaking the language being successful as code breakers.
Now, the book has an enormous amount of examples in it, but if you had to pick something, what's the holy grail of code breaking now? What remains to be done?
Both Klaus and I have a list of what we call the most famous unsolved codes, or sometimes famous and not so famous unsolved codes. Though it's tricky to tell sometimes if a code has been uncracked for hundreds of years, whether it's really a code or whether it might just be a hoax at the time. I have the Beale ciphers at the top of my list, but probably a hoax. It depends which day that you ask me. There's also the Voynich manuscript. Klaus, you want to talk about your favorites?
Let's get close on that one, but let's go start with Beale, because you do a big thing in Beale in the book. And since you're here, I have to ask you about what is it?
And it's actually the Beale, which led to us writing the book. In the 1800s, in the late 1800s, a pamphlet was published in Northern Virginia that talked about how some Virginians had gone treasure hunting in the Southwest United States and found a lot of gold, which they had then shipped back. and hidden somewhere in the Northern Virginia area, that the person who hid it, Thomas Beale, had then encrypted some messages, which he left with an innkeeper. And later, a friend of the innkeeper decrypted one of the messages using the Declaration of Independence, and it talked about what was hidden. But the other two messages supposedly said where it was hidden and who it belonged to. And no one has been able to crack those two messages.
It's like the Oak Island Gold in Canada. That's cool. Yeah. And Klaus, is it the Voynich one that you're working on?
Well, the Voynich is actually really the holy grail of encryption, but there are so many people working on it and so much has been published about it. So it's not my favorite topic. I think there are so many which are less known, but still fascinating. And the chance that they will be deciphered is a lot bigger. For example, there's one postcard from the 19th century. Usually encrypted postcards are very easy to solve because the encryption is very simple. But there's this one exception, which is sometimes driving me mad because simply it's different. I don't know how to encrypt it. Nobody, I've blogged about it, written about it, talked about it to many people, but so far nobody has been successful in deciphering it. So this is one of my favorites. Or I have a cigarette case from 1912 from Germany with an encrypted dedication. So nothing really special. It probably was a Christmas present or something like that. But the encrypted dedication looks pretty simple. Looks like it can be broken just in 5 minutes or so, but that's not the case. So far, many people have looked at it, but so far nobody has found the solution. And there are many stories like these, and these are the really interesting ones for me.
Another big one is what's called the Dorabella cipher, which was written by the composer Edward Elgar, who wrote Pomp and Circumstance.
Yeah.
And it was just a short message that he wrote to a friend. You would think, she wasn't a cryptographer, so you would think it would be fairly solvable, but it's been over 100 years. No one's cracked it yet.
Wow. Before I let you guys go, because you did mention computers in the book, and I do have to ask you, we have basically an IT interested audience in there. Can we talk about encryption now? How safe is encryption at this point? Can we break the codes that are in our computers?
Pencil and paper? No, it needs computers.
Yeah. Of course, when you use encryption in a computer program, you use modern technology, modern encryption algorithms such as RSA or AES. And I think it's safe to say that these methods are secure. It's simply not possible to break AES. What is possible is to break the implementation or to guess a password or things like that. But the methods as such are very secure, and I certainly wouldn't worry about that. I would more worry about the human factor around it. So even the best encryption is good for nothing if it's used with a bad password or things like that.
Yeah, and I'm forever giving good advice. And I can test this with you guys, your codes. I always tell people the longer your password, the better, that it's harder to crack because it's longer, never mind whether you try to do anything fancy with it. Is that good advice?
In general, it's true. Of course, if you take a long word, it's also a long password, but it might be easy to guess. So it should be long, or at least have a certain length and contain many different characters and special characters and numbers. And you should change it as often as possible. But all this is not realistic. Having a good password and keeping it for a while is probably the best strategy. And we in the industry say anyway that passwords are the wrong means for getting for secure authentication. It's better to use something like a smart card or a smart token or a secure element in a smartphone. All this is a lot better. This technology has been around for a long time, but still most people don't use it, or most companies don't offer it to their users.
A password that is generally, it's going to be secure. You want it to be more than 8 characters. You don't want it to be a dictionary word. You want to include something with punctuation in it. If I need a quick password, I'll pick 2 words and then a punctuation symbol and a number, and that's usually pretty good.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask, this may be unfair, closer, and look, you're also in the industry, but what about quantum computers? Will they provide us with unbreakable encryption finally?
It's more the other way around. With a quantum computer, you can break current encryption. For example, RSA. RSA is a very popular encryption system. It's used just about everywhere, for example, by web browsers. And RSA can be broken by a quantum computer, at least in theory. So the models that are available today are not strong enough, but in 20 years, it might be different. So at the moment, it's an important task to migrate to quantum-proof methods. The quantum computer won't help us very much with security. It's the other way around. It will help the code breakers.
So we've done our mandatory computer thing, and I promised I'd get back to you, Lonka, with this, because this drove me crazy when I saw it. And that's because I'm not a conspiracy theorist person, but I love mysteries. The crypto sculpture in the CIA headquarters. What is that about?
So when the CIA was building a new headquarters building, they commissioned artists to put art around the building. And one, Jim Sanborn, decided he wanted to do a sculpture with the theme of encryption. And he was teamed with Ed Scheidt, a retiring CIA cryptography expert. And Ed taught Jim about various codes. And Jim came up with the messages and carved encrypted messages into the sculpture. There's 4 messages. 3 of the 4 have been solved. 4th has not been solved yet. And it is one of the most famous unsolved codes in the world.
Wow. What's the next things you want to work on? What's on your private list?
We're writing papers on a few different things. For example, I just helped proof a paper on the cracking of the Z340. It actually just came out, I think, yesterday, written by the 3 men who had cracked it. Klaus and I are also working on things about encrypted French newspaper ads and also the Collinson ciphers. This was in the mid-1800s. A British sea captain who was looking for the remains of the Franklin expedition was on a 5-year mission aboard the ship, the Enterprise. And
You said Franklin and Enterprise. Now I'm wrapped now. Sorry.
And he and his family had been discussing how best he could get news from home while he was on this mission, and no one would quite know which port he was going to be in at any particular time. So they did this by putting encrypted ads into the London Times once a month, usually around the 1st of the month, and it would just show up there at the top. And if you decrypted it, which we can do now, but for a long time, the method was unknown, and it would give him some news from home about people and who's moving where and projects they were working on, like donating stained glass windows to churches. And it was just a lovely bits of news from home for 5 years. And so we've got a big project right now where we're decrypting all 50 odd messages and writing up a coherent story of what was going on.
Klaus, what's your big project?
Same, we're working on this together. I'm also working in the field of post-quantum cryptography. That's something that is quite important on my job at the moment. So maybe I will publish a book about post-quantum cryptography. That would be one of my next projects.
Well, you guys are going to make my reading list. And in discovering this, I found an earlier book I've got to check out by Lonka. So yeah, and we'll put links in the show notes if you guys will send them to us so that people can follow you and find out what you're working on in there. I want to thank you both for a fascinating book, and I can't recommend it enough. It's their hands-on, even if you're an amateur who just wants to understand code breaking better. It's very accessible. And I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for a fascinating discussion in there. Phil Zimmerman, who writes on the book, says, he's the creator of Pretty Good Privacy, he said, "It brings back the joy I felt when I first read about these things as a kid. I couldn't say it any better." My guests today have been Lonka Dunin and Klaus Schmey, the authors of Code Breaking, a Practical Guide. We'll put a link in the show notes so that you can actually find the book and find out how to get it and follow them. Hashtag Trending has a daily news program 5 days a week and a weekend show with fascinating guests and a topic that's interesting and somehow related to technology, hopefully both, and I think we pulled that off today. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to Midori Nagai for stepping in as my sound engineer, and thanks to you for spending part of your weekend with us. I'm your host, Jim Love. Catch me on Monday for the news from the weekend. I'll talk to you then.